This is PowerPoint Lecture 1 in Microeconomics on the assumptions, opportunity cost, and production possibility curves. Let's learn some microecon. Before we get going here, let me just make mention of something. The book makes mention of it on page 7 in Chapter 1. An epistemological concern. For those of you unfamiliar with the idea of epistemology is how we come to know something. And economics is committed to the scientific process. In many universities, economics is in the social sciences. In the college that I went to, it was considered in the social sciences. What we start off with is a few basic assumptions. Now, in epistemological concerns, the assumptions aren't something that are something that's questioned. Okay, what we want to try to do is we want to try to develop a logical and mathematical consistency based on these assumptions. Most of what we talk about in the following 8 weeks is going to rest on these 3 simple assumptions. Okay, we want to take a look at them. We don't want them to be completely unreasonable, but this is the beginning of the scientific process. See, this is the scientific process always begins with assumptions. Newton does this in Principles of Motion, if you've ever read Sir Isaac Newton's Principles of Motion, in which he ultimately develops as one of the correlates the idea of gravity. Gravity is a correlate logically derived from the 3 laws of motion. Well, we have similar things in economics. Okay, we have similar things in any scientific process of study. Okay. Now, what you end up with is a theory that from which you can derive hypotheses, and these hypotheses are then are tested on empirical observation, and economics does this. This is the kind of stuff the book talks about a little bit on pages 7 and 8. And so, in that sense, this is a scientific study. Now, we want to look at the assumptions. I'll give you an example of this. Okay, I'll give you an example of this from the field of mathematics. Okay, I don't know if any of you have ever studied geography. Most people have to take geography at some point in their high school days or college days. But if you take geometry, geometry is entirely based on assumptions and postulated conditions. An assumption is largely a postulated condition. Okay, I'll give you an example. Okay, a square is a quadrilateral with 4 equal sides. That's a postulated condition. There's no proving that. That's an assumption. There's absolutely no reason to believe that that's the case. The only reason that is the case is because someone has stipulated that it is the case. From that, we then develop logical correlates, okay, logical conclusions. So if we say, okay, this is a quadrilateral, this quadrilateral that we see before us is a square, and one of its sides is 2 inches long, we therefore can hypothesize that the remaining sides have to be 2 inches long because of the postulated condition. Okay, I just wanted to make a brief mention of that, so we know where we're started with here, so we don't. Okay, now let's look at our first assumption, that resources are scarce. That's not an unreasonable assumption. We live in a finite system. The world itself is finite. In fact, when we extrapolate from that, the entire universe is finite. People don't think this. People used to think that the universe was infinite. Well, it's very, very, very big, but it's not infinite, because what we know from the Big Bang Theory, and what we know from modern physics anyways, is that most parts of the universe are expanding. Well, if the universe is expanding, it must be expanding into something. If something is infinite, it can't expand because it encompasses everything. There's kind of a little aside there, right? Yeah, okay. That'll get your minds thinking. We want to start getting your minds thinking, right? We want to start thinking logically like an economist thinks. Okay, so the resources are scarce. That's not an unreasonable assumption. Second, that economic actors are rational. Now, textbooks, entire courses in psychology are devoted to what is meant by rational. In economics, we restrict this to really mean that all of the players in the game of economics, and we'll look at game theory a little bit later on, maybe. I have a tendency in my dissertation and in graduate school, I used a lot of theory of games, which is a mathematical technique, and so I have a tendency to use the terminology from there. But every participant in economics, okay, we say that they're rational. What that means is every participant in economics wants the most for the least. The laborer, for example, wants the most amount of money for the least amount of work. The producer of an item wants the most amount of revenue for the least amount of cost. Okay? A simple enough assumption. The last assumption, that economic actors are self-interested, and that's a little bit more difficult, okay? And in point of fact, on a philosophical level, this is the main difference between Adam Smith, who wrote Wealth of Nations in 1776, and Karl Marx, who wrote throughout the early and late and mid 19th century. For Adam Smith, this is one of the assumptions. Human beings are self-interested. They will place their own needs ahead of the collective needs of others. Okay? It's a dog-eat-dog world. This is a natural extension, not that we're going to get into it, it's too tangential, of contract theory itself. If you read through social contract theory with Thomas Hobbes or John Locke or Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they all depict human beings as these self-centered animals, hell-bent on their own personal salvation with no regard to others. Okay, that's the basis of social contract theories. That's why you institute a government, is to regulate their behavior. Adam Smith is derived from this. For Karl Marx, on the other hand, human beings are in fact caring, loving animals. Okay, they are generous, they are virtuous, they are conditioned by the capital system to become self-interested. Okay, they are like little Pavlovian dogs. Okay, and just kind of, and again, we're resting here on these assumptions for just a second to begin thinking philosophically and to begin thinking of the underpinnings of economics itself. Okay, and the underpinnings of a lot of things. Okay, but I mean, what people say is, oh no, look out there, you can see human nature is such that they're all self-interested. Well, that's kind of like saying that a dog, by its nature, will drool when it hears the sound of a bell. For those of you familiar, this is reference to Pavlov's experiment, okay, on behavioral conditioning. All right, he took a dog, and every time he rang a bell, he would feed the dog, and so the dog associated a bell ringing with food, and so when he would ring the bell, the dog would begin to drool. We do not therefore conclude that a dog by its nature will drool when it hears the sound of a bell. He was conditioned to do that. And so too, for Marx, the capital system itself conditions human beings to behave self-interested. Okay, to behave for their own, to place themselves ahead of the collective. Just kind of a little. What's always interested me, I've practiced Tai Chi. I'm a practitioner of Tao. I've practiced Tai Chi for a little better than 12 years. Okay, and what always interested me, what I saw immediately when I started my study of economics, and most of my economics I studied on my own, because in my college I didn't have enough time to sit there and pack in economics courses. It would have taken me forever, and it was costing an arm and a leg anyways. So what I would do, while other people, I understand this is just, I'm one of those kind of geeky guys, that while other people would take their money and go out and go drinking and go have a social life and do all that and have friendships and things like that, I didn't. I was more like Sheldon in The Big Bang Theory. What I would do with any extra money I had is I'd go and buy textbooks. So I went and bought economics textbooks and read them and learned economics. Took some classes there, and before you know it, I was right on the course of becoming a political economist. I'm a political economist by trade. I study the relationship of politics and economics. I study both. Okay, but what always interested me, back to this idea of the practice of Tai Chi, and you see here the Tai Chi of economics. In Tai Chi, we work with the two basic energies of Tao, the two basic energies in existence: Yin energy and Yang energy. Okay, Yin energy is the energy of reception, taking in. Yang energy is the energy of initiation. Okay, and that's enough said about that. But in economics, all participants in economics, from the individual laborer, the individual consumer, the individual producer, all participate in two things: consumption and production. And we'll look at this as we go through our half-mester. That's what I call this. An eight-week class is a half-mester. Okay, we'll see if that catches on. But at any rate, we'll see this as we go through. For example, a producer. Well, a producer of what do we want the guy to make? Let's say let's say it's a lawn service, a lawn mowing. The guys mow the lawns, right? Whatnot, does landscaping. That's what they call it, landscaping service. Okay. Okay, well, we know what they produce. They produce landscaping services. They cut hedges, plant flowers, cut yards, whatever. They consume gasoline, lawn mowers, whatever it takes to produce landscaping services. Most notably, what do they consume? Labor. Okay, that's true of all producers. That's one of their primary consumptions. Okay, for a consumer, for you and me, and I don't know how many of you guys work. Okay, but for you and me, I'm a consumer. Okay, I consume things. I eat. Okay, that's consumption. But I also produce. What do I produce? I produce labor. Okay, I produce a service for Robert Morris University. Okay, now and that's why I say all economic actors participate in both. This is a basic flow diagram. You see up here, I reference figure 2.2 on page 43 of the book, and as I mentioned to you in the introductory video, it's a little bit different in this class. What we want to think about is the driving force of this class is the PowerPoints and the PowerPoint lectures. The book is supportive of these rather than vice versa. Okay, most classes it's like it's the book and the PowerPoints that are taken directly from the publisher, and that drives the whole class. We don't do that here. That's probably because of my arrogance. I'm probably going to have to bring that up in therapy at some point, but let's move past that. But this is very similar to the flow diagram. It's a very basic diagram. This explains what I've just said, okay? You have two types of producers, and we'll deal with this when we get to types of goods. You have basically two types of producers. You have producers that produce inputs, such as in the primary industry, such as, let's look at an extraction industry, which is mining. Okay, coal. Okay, let's think about them. They produce coal. Well, that's used as an input by other producers, namely, say, steel producers. Okay? Then you have a firm that produces finished goods and services. All right? Then you have the individual. Okay? So now let's follow out. Let me get my laser pointer up here, if I can. I'm going to make ample use of this laser pointer. I love the thing. Okay? Let's start here. This is where all economics begins, with the production of labor. Why? Because if nobody produces, if nobody labors, nothing is produced. Okay, so can we just start with that simple understanding? Let's rest for a minute if we have to. All economics, everything, begins with labor. All right? The individual produces labor. They produce labor for the firm that produces inputs, such as the coal mine, and they produce labor for the firm that produces finished goods and services, such as steel, such as an automobile. Okay? Now, this firm produces inputs that are processed by this firm. This firm then sells its output to individuals. You'll notice that the input firm doesn't sell to the individual. Okay? That's because their product, the input firms, okay, their product is a factor of production in this firm. Okay, so they produce for them. They produce, and that's what creates a circular flow. Now, a little bit later on, we'll take a look and we'll put government in this. Yeah, and what we'll see is that government produces actually nothing. Some bastards. Oh, well, no, I don't want to get off on too much of a tangent there. That's macroeconomics, anyways. We'll be at that at the end of our term here. But at any rate, that's your basic flow. Okay, so we want to understand this. The laborer produces the labor, and technically speaking, labor is going to count as an intermediate good. We'll get to that in the next PowerPoint lecture 2. Okay, the input firm produces factors of production that are used by the firm that produces the finished goods and services, okay, which are then consumed by the individual, okay, who then produces labor. And we can come up with dozens and dozens and dozens of examples of this. I'll just give you a couple, since we're sitting around here. I'll give you a couple. Okay, let's look at a farmer. Okay, let's say I'm a farmhand. I produce labor on the farm. Okay, and we can look at it either as that farm can either be an input firm or a firm producing a finished goods and service. How? Think it through. Think about this. This is what I'm trying to get you guys to do. This is what I want you to do. I'm going to keep doing this throughout our term. This is what I'm going to do over and over, is try to get you to start thinking about things that you take for granted, that you don't ever think about, that you don't okay? How could it be that me as a farmhand producing, agricultural products, that farm would be an input farm. Well, what if I'm working on a hay farm? Okay? They have hay farms. That's where hay comes from. Okay? You grow wheat. You grow alfalfa. Alfalfa is one of the most expensive hays there is. We used to grow it on the farm when I was an undergraduate. I lived on a 111-acre organic farm, and we were part of a collective, and actually it was our neighbor in the collective that grew alfalfa for hay, and we used to go over and help them harvest their alfalfa. Okay? Well, that alfalfa is then sold to a farm that produces usually livestock, such as beef, okay, things like that, cattle, okay. That then is the finished good, the cattle, which is slaughtered, cut up, sold into steaks, and then sold back to the individual farmhand. Now, myself, I don't eat cows and steaks and stuff like that. Look at the same thing. Anything, for anything. Okay, let's look at a restaurant employee. Let's say I'm a cook. Okay, a lot of the examples I'm going to use a cook. I was a cook for 23 years. Okay, all through college and in the beginning of when I was teaching, even at Robert Morris. I kind of my last commercial job was in 2006. Okay, but at any rate, as a cook, what do I produce? Now in this case, I'm producing for a finished good or service. I'm not really producing for an input. If you really stretched it, you might be able to consider that. What if, like, I was cooking, and let's go back to, remember I had a landscaping example about 2 minutes ago? Let's go back to our landscapers. Let's suppose our landscapers are out working one day, and they take a lunch break, and they call in an order to the restaurant I'm working at, and I produce meals, okay, for the landscapers. Does that count as an input? That's a bit of a stretch. You might be able to count it as an input. We'll deal with that again. There are some things in economics that are dead solid, certain, perfect. There are others that are open for discussion. Okay? For the most part, though, as a cook, I'm producing a finished good and service. Okay? I produce labor. My restaurant produces a finished good and service. Other consumers purchase it. Maybe I purchase it, whatever. Okay, so that's our circular flow diagram. One of the most important concepts in economics, one of the most important concepts in life, one of the things that we want you to leave Robert Morris understanding, doesn't matter what your major is. Doesn't matter what your major is, and it doesn't matter if you do economics or not, because you will face this. You have already faced this. You are facing this currently. Opportunity cost. Okay? Now, they have highfalutin definitions of it. Let's work with a simple, practical, easy to work with definition. Okay? To do or to have one thing, you have to sacrifice doing or having something else. And you see there, that flows directly from the assumption of scarcity of resources. If resources are scarce, if my resources are scarce, that means I have to make decisions. I have to make choices. You made a choice. Go to college. There you are at high school. You stand at the turning point. Go to college, get a degree, try to get a job. Or go to work. Okay? That's a choice that you have to make. That's opportunity cost. I can produce one thing or another thing. I can work as a server in a restaurant, as a cook in a restaurant. I can work for a landscaping firm. I can work for a lawyer's office. These are all based on opportunity cost. Okay? I can go to Robert Morris. I can go to Pitt. I can go to Duquesne. I can go anywhere in the world. Okay? That's opportunity cost. Now, that's to do one thing. To have one thing is the same thing. Let's suppose you got $10 in your pocket. Okay? I'm confronted with that $10 with 100 choices. I can either have the $10 in my pocket, or I could have, let's see, I just bought a Three Musketeers bar that was $1.25. Okay? Or I could have what? 8 Three Musketeers bars. Or I could have 4 Three Musketeers bars and still have $5. Okay? This sacrifice of things is essential to an understanding of economics. And it's ultimately going to get to the distinction for us, and we'll cover it a few different times, but it gets to the distinction between economic costs and accounting costs. Accounting costs include only the actual monetary value of a thing. Okay, so when we think about a college education, most of the time when you think of a college education, you're thinking of the accounting cost. Tuition, books, room and board, whether you live on campus or not. Okay, these are the accounting costs of school. But there are also economic costs in addition to those. Economic costs include accounting costs, but economic costs also include the opportunity cost. Okay, so in addition to your accounting costs for college, you also have an opportunity cost. Okay, instead of going to school, you could be, climbing the ladder in what I'm sure would be a lucrative career in the food service industry, serving fries at your local McDonald's. Okay, that's an opportunity cost. We deal with this. In fact, one of the things that I've noticed, I've been at Robert Morris now for 15 years. Okay, and one of the things I've noticed is that a lot of the determination of the success or failure of students is based on their understanding of this simple principle. Okay, many of the students I know at Robert Morris work while going to college. And they struggle with this idea of opportunity cost, not the understanding of it, but the actual practical application of it. Why? Because, okay, I go to school to earn money, to support myself as, or rather, I go to work to earn money, to support myself so I can go to school. The problem is when I sacrifice the quality and quantity of my schoolwork in order to work more hours. Okay? That's a fundamental misunderstanding of the priorities in my opportunity cost. The one is a means to an end. So this opportunity cost is pivotally important to us. We have to understand this, okay? We now move into factors of production. Again, this is something that's very simple to understand. So we want to get the hang of it, okay? We want to get it down. Let's think of anything. Think of any product that's made. Doesn't matter. Look, wherever you are, we're listening to this. Look around the room. Find a product. Find something that's produced. I'm sitting here, I'm in my living room. Okay? Right over here, I got a lamp. Okay? Any product. It doesn't matter. I got a fish tank. Doesn't matter. Any product. Okay? Anything that exists. Any product. Okay? Was made somewhere. That means land is one of our factors of production. It was made by someone. So labor is a factor of production. It was made using something. Now, not every product is made using something. Okay, I'll give you an example. An apple. An apple isn't made using anything. Has land, doesn't it? Of course it does. It has an apple tree. The apple tree has to grow somewhere. Labor? Well, yeah, I mean, even if you're walking along and you pick the apple up off the ground, okay, you've still labored to get that apple. Otherwise, it would just be lying there. Okay, if you pick it off the tree, that's labor. So, okay, somebody had to pick it. But it can end right there. I don't necessarily need capital equipment. Now, most of the time, like if you've ever gone blueberry picking or strawberry picking or apple picking, okay, most of the time you're going to have capital equipment with you. I don't mean you're going to have something to harvest the apples from the tree, but most of the time what are you going to have? You're going to have a basket. You'll pick an apple and throw it in the basket. Okay, so that basket's capital equipment, and it's helping you produce it. Okay, so it's generally thought of that everything's produced using something. I'm sitting here looking around, and I'm looking at my fish tank right now. Okay, that was made somewhere. Someone made it, and they obviously used some capital equipment to glue it together and whatnot. All right? In addition, all construction is included as capital. What I mean by that is buildings. That's really more relevant for macroeconomics in terms of gross domestic product accounting. And then the final factor of production, one that actually I usually exclude. Okay? But it needs to be in there. It's important. It's relevant. The reason I exclude it is it's very difficult to empirically observe it. It's the most difficult of the factors to measure. Entrepreneurial ability, the skill in creating it. the strength of managerial skill, okay, in producing products. Now, for those of you who do work, there are ways. I mean, come on, let's face it, okay? I don't know how many of you guys work, but if you work, like when I worked at restaurants, it doesn't take long to be able to differentiate between the entrepreneurial ability of your bosses. I've worked for really good restaurant managers, and I've worked for really good kitchen managers, and I've worked for really bad ones. I'll give you just one example. The last restaurant I worked at, up until 2006, I'd worked there for 5 years, okay? And it was a successful business. It had been a successful business for 25 years. It was doing well. She sold it to a guy who was an absolute yutz. The guy literally, every single decision he made was bad. He took a business that was successful and making a profit for 25 years and drove it into bankruptcy within a year. And we all lost our jobs because of it. It was just absolutely unbelievable. That's entrepreneurial ability. It's difficult to really measure. That's why I don't like it that much. We now deal with another of the most significant concepts in economics. Now, this one comes to us from the first chapter. We'll flip real quick here to page 13 of the book. And you see this is the first discussion of the production possibilities curve. Okay? And you see here's just your basic production possibilities curve. I'll get out my handy dandy laser pointer, which we're all going to get used to. This is from figure 1.2. Now, I want you to be able, in your mind, to connect these things together. This directly flows from what we just discussed. The reason that I've chopped things up the way I've chopped them up for our half-semester, okay, is because the way that McConnell, Brew, and Flynn do it, the way Schiller does it in Survey of Economics, okay, for his book on Survey of Economics, okay, the economic points are all fine, but the organization of them, I don't like the logical consistency. Ours is going to be a very tight logical consistency, as I described to you in the introductory video. Okay, the production possibility curve comes directly from what we said about opportunity cost. Okay, so look, product Y, product X. Doesn't matter what they are. Let's say boozing with my buddies, studying my economics. Okay, there's two things I can do. There's opportunity cost. I have to make a choice. Okay, let's say producing shoes, producing tennis rackets. Okay, being a lawyer. Okay, being an HVAC technician. Right? Okay. Now, what this curve represents is the maximum use of all resources. We know what the resources are, don't we? We just studied them in the last slide. Land, labor, and capital. If I'm using to the fullest potential, exploiting as best I can, all land, labor, and capital, I'm on this line. Points C and D both exist on this line. Okay? And so I can produce a maximum of this many Y units and a maximum of this many X units. Or if I'm using all of my resources efficiently and to their maximum potential, any combination of X and Y that exist along this line. Simple enough? Okay. Now if I'm producing in here, such as at point A, what does that mean? Well, let's think it through. I'm producing at point A this many Y, okay, and we'll look at a numerical example of it, but we don't need to, okay, for now, to understand it. I'm producing this many Y and this many X. What does that mean? That means that I'm not using all of my resources, okay? I'm not, what is it they say? I'm not living up to my potential, okay? Okay, so I'm producing at point Y. So maybe, for example, in macroeconomics, okay, during a time of a recession, when the economy goes into a recession, people stop spending and the economy begins to suffer a negative growth rate, you're in here, okay? people get laid off work, etc., etc., etc. So if I'm not maximizing my resources, I'm producing at point A. Now, point B out here, I can't produce. Why? Because it's beyond my capacity. This is my productive capacity right here. Okay, it's what we refer to as plant capacity. That's the maximum I can produce. So point B is beyond my capacity. The only way I could reach that is if I expanded my resources, my factors of production. Let's look at a more practical example. And as I mentioned to you, I was a cook for 23 years, so a lot of the examples that I bring into economics classes are from the restaurant industry. So you just are going to have to get used to that. A lot of it's kind of nice, though, because a lot of Robert Morris students work as servers and things like that, so they're used to the restaurant industry themselves. But okay, so here we have, we're at a restaurant, local tavern, okay, right? We got a choice. We can produce two things back in the kitchen: fish sandwiches, burgers. Okay. Now, and we look at the PPC here. If I maximize the use of all my resources, I have my cooks, I have all my kitchen equipment, I have everything I can use, all my resources, all my capital equipment, all my labor, and of course the land, the area that the kitchen is. If I maximize my production, okay, I can produce 120 fish sandwiches a day. Boom. Okay. Or, again, if I maximized my resources, I could produce, what does it say here, 54 burgers a day. Okay, we see that this comes from there. Now, I want you to see that these come from each other, okay? All of the points on the line here. I did this in Excel. Okay, you have 120, then you have 100, then down to 80, down to 60, down to 40, down to 20, and then down to 0. This is going to become important because of the sacrifice ratio, because what we're going to notice, and what we noticed in the previous slide when we first introduced production possibility curves, is the production possibility curve is not a straight line. Now the book says that it's always going to be. It says right here, if you flip to page 14 of the book, it says law of increasing opportunity costs. I see that, and it goes through me like a rusty steel nail through the forehead. Okay? Let me return. I understand this little tangential, okay, but just let me return for a minute. Okay, to what I opened with, this idea of epistemology. The term law, in the entirety of this semester, we're going to deal with very few. The two most important are the law of demand and the law of supply. Okay? But for something to be a law, it must be axiomatic. It must be universally true in every case. There can be no exception. If there is so much as one exception, it is not axiomatic, and it is therefore not a law. So when it says the law of increasing opportunity costs there, it's not a law. It's generally true. It's not always true. You want an example of when it's not true? I'll give you an example of when it's not true. There you are on a given evening as a student at Robert Morris, taking microeconomics, and taking psychology, intro to psych. Okay? You have a choice to make. On any given evening, you have a choice to make. Study my econ, study my psychology. Well, the only resource you have there, you have land, you have your labor, and we could count as capital maybe the time consumed. Okay? Your PPC would be a straight line. 1 hour of studying psychology is the same as 1 hour of studying economics. All right? It's infinitely transferable. That hour is infinitely transferable. You can do whatever you want with that hour. Okay? And I know I've been at Robert Morris for 15 years. I know the choice that's made by Robert Morris students. Most of the time, confronted with such a choice between psychology and economics, they go to the bar and drink. No, that's not true. That was a gratuitous shot at Robert Morris students. I can't believe you said that. No, I said that. No, that's not true. That's not true. Robert Morris students are very committed and to their studies. Okay, so here we are back at our restaurant with this example. You can produce burgers. You can produce fish. I mean, really, this is based on Aristotelian logic. Aristotelian logic is based on dichotomization. It can either be A or not A, which is a logical consistency. Okay? It can either be a fish sandwich or not a fish sandwich. In this case, I've just used burgers. It could be anything, right? Could be anything other than a fish sandwich. I do fish sandwiches because I love fish sandwiches. I'm a pescatarian, actually. I'm a pescapolitarian is what my wife calls me, and I'll let you figure out what that means, pescapolitarian. But at any rate, all right. So if we maximize our use of resources, make 54 burgers or 120 fish, or the maximization of resources anywhere along this line. Now, if I'm producing in here, I'm not maximizing my resources. Why am I not maximizing my resources? Well, maybe my cooks, maybe my cooks are a bunch of drunks and stoners. Okay, and so they're not working as efficiently as they could. Instead of cooking, they're out back smoking dope or whatever the hell they do. Okay, out here I can't produce more than that because I only have so much kitchen space. I only have so much kitchen equipment. I only have so much labor. Okay, so I can't produce that many. So I'm limited. As long as I'm producing along this line, I'm making the most efficient use of my resources. All right. Now, what we're going to get into is a sacrifice ratio. Now, we may as well just take a look at it right now. Let's take a look at this. I start off producing the maximum amount of fish, 120 fish sandwiches a day, and no burgers. When I begin to transfer resources out of the production of fish to produce a few burgers, okay, for the first 20 fish sandwiches that I give up making, I get 15 burgers. But notice, for the next 20 fish that I give up, I'm only going to get 13 burgers. I then give up 20 more fish sandwiches. Now I only get 10 burgers. I give up 20 fish sandwiches. Now I only get 8. Now only 5. Now only 3. Now I'm going to explain why that is. This is this law of increasing opportunity costs. It has to do with the fungibility of resources. Now, factors of production we use synonymously with resources, okay? We note that the PPC is not a straight line, okay? As we move production from one thing, okay, as with the previous slide, from fish sandwiches to burgers, we're going to get, let's think about the resources we're using, land, labor, and capital, okay? Land is the most fungible of all the resources, okay? I can either, in the same kitchen space, I can cook whatever the hell I want to cook. I can cook fish sandwiches, I can cook burgers, I can cook tacos, I can make potato pancakes, I can make pancakes, I can make pizzas, I can make anything I want in that kitchen. Okay? So the land can be infinitely transferable. That's where I'm going to get my greatest gains. Then laborers. Well, yeah, labor's transferable. Okay. Now, as it works out, in a lot of the restaurants I was at, labor wasn't as transferable as you might think because some of the cooks weren't good at cooking things, and some of the cooks were good at cooking other things. Okay? We're going to see this as we go throughout. We're going to see this with other things as well. All right? And I'll have another example of that in just a second here. So labor, now that I'm transferring labor, some of my laborers are good at one thing, some are good at another, so I'm going to lose a little bit of that transferability. And the least transferable of all is capital, okay? Because, so for example, a fish sandwich, for the most part, is cooked in a fryer, deep fryer. Well, that's completely useless in cooking a burger. I don't know if you've ever tried that. Try cooking a burger in a fryer. You actually can do it. I've known people that have done it. It's really disgusting, and it's gross, and it's unbelievable that they do this. Yeah, you take your patty, your burger patty, okay, and put it in the basket of a fryer and then dip it into the 350-degree fryer to cook it. Yeah, I know, right? Yeah, no, you don't want to do that. Please, you don't want to do that. It's really nasty. Most of the time it falls apart. In the instances where it does stay together, it's just this greasy, nasty, but so it's not transferable. Now we use a different example here. Let's look at Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh area. Okay, Pittsburgh was, all the time I grew up, my dad was in the steel industry. My dad was superintendent of chemical processing down at Clairton Works. Okay, so he wasn't really a laborer at steel. He was a manager. Okay, but Pittsburgh was based on steel. Well, what I watched, really beginning in the late 70s and still going on today, but really it kind of settled down by the turn of the century, Pittsburgh has had a transition. It's what they refer to as the Renaissance, okay, from steel production, okay, over to healthcare. Now let's take a look at this transition. let's look at land. Sure enough. Well, look down at the south side. Okay, you got UPMC South Side down there on Carson Street. All right, that used to be a steel mill. That was a steel mill. That was a J&L steel mill. Okay, that whole length of Carson Street was a J&L steel mill. They plowed down the mill. They actually sold it off. They sold it off to not in America, in the United States. They sold it off to foreign steel producers. But they sold that off. Okay, so they cleared the land. Then they built a hospital on it. They built a lot of things. They built restaurants. They built nightclubs. They built a hospital. Okay, easy to do, transferable. Okay, labor. Oh, this is one of the things that gets us. There's a difference between practical economics and theoretical economics. All right, theoretically, yeah, labor should be transferable. The steel workers, the guys working in the steel mills, working the blast furnaces and the rolling mills. Okay, we'll put them to work now in our hospital. Yeah, I guess you can do that. You can send them to college. Okay, you can send them through tech school. They can become radiation technicians or, neurosurgeons or whatever the hell you want to make them. On paper, okay, yeah, it works. In practical application, it doesn't really work. Sometimes it does. Sometimes it doesn't. Okay, so your labor is going to be less transferable. Not everybody's going to make that transition. So you're going to lose some of your productivity there. And then we finally get down to capital. And at capital, you're getting you're getting nothing. Okay, you're getting very little. Okay, when you transfer the capital from steel production into the production of healthcare, you're getting virtually no gain at all for the capital you're transferring, because let's face it, a rolling mill, blast furnace is useless in the provision of healthcare. Although you could, if you wanted to, if you really wanted to, you could make that blast furnace useful. Okay, when people die in hospitals all the time. When they die, instead of burying them, you could throw them in the blast furnace, burn them up. It's like a crematorium. Okay, we'd have to restrict it, though. Only the patients that want to be cremated would be allowed to be thrown in the blast furnaces. Some people, they want to be buried so their families can come and visit them after they're dead and sing songs over their bones and such like that. But the people that want to be cremated, ooh, we've got just the thing for you. We've got a blast furnace here. Yeah, and they can't do that. They wouldn't have anything to put in the urn and put on their mantelpiece. Can't do that. So when it gets to capital, you have your least fungible resource. All right? Shifting in PPC. Okay? An inward shift of the PPC line. Okay? And we're going to go over this PPC again and again. So if you don't get it the first time through, it's a simple enough idea. You should be able to get through. If you don't get the first time through, we'll have other shots at it. But an inward shift of the PPC line, okay, represents a reduction in the factors of production. An outward shift, an increase. Now, under what conditions would we have a decrease in the factors of production? What if our population went down? What if we suffered a negative population growth rate, or at least a negative labor force growth rate? Okay, we'd have fewer laborers. Okay, what if we had destruction as the result of war or natural disaster? In fact, this is one of the things in my world geography class. When we get to sub-Saharan Africa, the focus of our discussion in sub-Saharan Africa is poverty. Sub-Saharan Africa is the most impoverished region on the planet. Well, one of the reasons for that impoverishment is because the other thing that's true of sub-Saharan Africa is that since 1960, there have been 11.5 million people killed as a direct result of combat. It's also the most violent region on the world, which is kind of counterintuitive. A lot of people think the Middle East is. It's not. Sub-Saharan Africa has much more. In fact, even as I'm narrating this, Sub-Saharan Africa currently has 5 ongoing combat insurgencies in progress. Okay, one in the Democratic Republic of Congo, one in the Central African Republic, one in Somalia, one in Nigeria, and one in I'm missing one of them. I said Somalia, Central African Republic, Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, and the other one is in Chad. Okay. No, not that this is a course on sub-Saharan Africa. Just kind of a tangent there. It's kind of a little bit of an aside. But at any rate, okay. So when things are destroyed like that and people are killed, you're going to drop your. It's going to be an inward shift of your production possibilities. An outward shift would be an increase in factors of production, such as investment. Okay. In our kitchen example, if we look at the individual restaurant we've been playing with throughout this lecture. Okay, if we look at our restaurant, what happens if I buy a new fryer? Okay, buy another grill, hire another cook. I'm increasing my factors of production. Okay, that's going to increase my production possibilities. All right, and I think that this is the last slide. I should always have one that says conclusion, but I think that this is the last slide. And so that's it. Oh no, here's PPC shifts. Okay, I do have one or two more. Here's the PPC shift slide. Okay, this is what I was just talking about: outward shift caused by increases in the factors of production, and that increase can either be in quantity or quality. Okay, if we keep the same number of laborers but increase their skill level so that they can produce more efficiently, that'll push our production possibility curve out. Okay.